On the 25th of July, 1943, Kummersdorf Proving Ground. This place was called the Cemetery of Hopes and the Forge of Victory. Here it smelled of pine trees, wet Brandenburg soil, and high-octane petrol. But on that day, the air smelled of animal fear. A group of senior officers stands around a steel monster, sheltering under tarpaulins. At the center of attention is a tiger. 57 tons of deadly Krupp steel, the pinnacle of technology, an invincible predator that was supposed to turn the tide of the war on the Eastern Front. But this predator is dead. Help promote this video with a like and subscription so that more people learn the truth. And ahead is a whole series of materials about events that have been hushed up for entire decades. It stands motionless in the middle of the test track. Its mighty 88mm gun looks gloomily downward, and the engine is silent. Around it, like ants whose queen has had her head torn off, run the best mechanics in Germany. They are in a panic. Tomorrow, at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, this particular specimen, a modernized prototype with a new transmission, must be shown to a special commission from Berlin. Rumors claimed that Albert Speer himself would be on the commission. If the tank does not move, heads will roll not in a figurative sense, but in the most literal one. Execution for sabotage was the mildest thing the engineers could hope for at that time. And here is where the most interesting part begins. In the official report of the Proving Ground Commandant's office for that day, a copy of which we managed to purchase at a closed auction in Argentina for a fabulous sum, there is a strange, almost illegible entry in pencil in the margins. Outside specialist, Category C, engaged. Who was this specialist? Category C in German bureaucracy of that time did not denote an invited engineer from the Henschel firm, nor a professor of physics. This was expendable material. This was a prisoner of war. But why, pray tell, did the elite of German tank construction need the help of a powerless slave? To understand the full horror of the situation in which the Proving Ground Commandant, Standartenführer Brunner, found himself, one must immerse oneself in the context of the era. Summer of '43. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht needed a symbol. They needed a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon. The Tiger was a capricious beast. Its heart, the Maybach HL 230 engine, was powerful but incredibly complex, and the transmission altogether resembled a Swiss watch magnified 1,000 times and placed in mud. On that day, the 25th of July, what everyone feared happened. The new experimental gearbox jammed solid. German mechanics, men with university educations, authors of textbooks, spent 6 hours at the tank. They changed gears, checked oil pressure. They all but prayed to their Teutonic gods of war. But the 50-ton machine did not budge a millimeter. Brunner was furious. He understood that tomorrow's failure would cost him his career, and possibly his life. And then his adjutant, a young lieutenant whose name history has not preserved but whose signature we see under the act of transferring the prisoner, remembered the rumors. In Barrack Number 7, where particularly important technical specialists from among the prisoners were held, there was one Russian. In German records, his name appears as unknown. Only personal number 4312. Why was he so important? Documents of Smersh, which miraculously survived after the purges of the archives in the 1950s, contained the interrogation protocol of one of the liberated inmates of the same camp. The witness claims that this man, before the war, worked as chief tester at one of the tractor factories in the Urals. They said that he felt metal with his skin, that he could determine an engine malfunction simply by putting his ear to the armor. Legend had it that near Kharkov, already shell-shocked, he single-handedly repaired his T-34 under mortar fire, using only a sledgehammer and a piece of wire, and brought the machine out of encirclement. The Germans, These pedantic perfectionists who believed only in instructions found themselves at an impasse. They had no instruction for when instructions did not work, and they decided to play roulette, Russian roulette with a German tank. Imagine this moment with cinematic clarity. The heavy gates of the camp creak open. A convoy of 4 submachine gunners leads out a man. He looks terrible, emaciated, in a dirty, oil-soaked coverall that hangs on him like a sack. His face is gray from camp dust and malnutrition. His cheekbones are stretched with skin so tightly that it seems they are about to break through. He can barely stand on his feet, swaying from the wind, but his eyes. Witnesses, and among the guards there were those who survived and later gave testimony to the Allies, said that his eyes burned with a cold, inhuman fire. This was not the gaze of a victim. This was the gaze of a predator who had temporarily found himself in a cage. They brought him to the tank. The rain intensified, turning into a real downpour. Water streamed down his face, washing away the dirt, but he did not even blink. Before him stood a giant, a tiger. German officers, well-fed in dry raincoats, looked at him like dirt under their feet. Brunner, through an interpreter, stated the conditions. They were simple and brutal, like everything at that time. Fix it, you get a tin of stew, a loaf of bread, and your life. Don't fix it, execution on the spot, right by the tracks. Silence hung over the proving ground. Only the drumming of drops on armor could be heard. The Russian mechanic slowly raised his head. He did not look at the officers. He looked at the tank. In his gaze, there was no fear of the machine. There was recognition, as if he had met an old enemy whose weaknesses he knew better than his own 5 fingers. He did not rush to the tools, did not begin to fuss as the Germans expected. He did what made the Standartenführer nervously grab his holster. The prisoner approached the tank closely and placed his palm on the cold, wet armor of the front plate. He ran his hand along the welded seam, as if stroking a beast he was about to tame or kill. It was an almost mystical moment. Man and machine, creator and destroyer. Then he turned to the interpreter and uttered a few words. His voice was hoarse, broken, but firm. He asked for tools, but not the standard Wehrmacht repairman's kit. He asked for a strange, almost absurd list of things. A 32mm spanner, a heavy hammer, a bucket of used oil, and a piece of dense canvas 1 meter by 1 meter. The officers exchanged glances. Why did he need canvas? One of the Henschel engineers snorted contemptuously. Probably wants to lay it down so as not to dirty his rags. Barbarian. Laughter rang out. How wrong they were. None of them, standing there with higher technical education, even guessed that this piece of fabric would become a key element in the plan that was maturing in the prisoner's head. A plan so audacious that believing in it was impossible. Commandant Brunner, glancing at his watch, nodded. There was no time for arguments. He did not care what this Russian did as long as the tank started. They brought the tools, threw them in the mud at the prisoner's feet. The mechanic slowly, conserving every movement, bent down and picked up the spanner. He weighed it in his hand, as if checking the balance. Then he took the bucket of black, thick oil, and finally, the rolled piece of canvas. He stuffed the canvas inside his coverall. This gesture escaped the attention of most, but not ours. In the incident report compiled by the Gestapo a week later, this moment will be underlined in red pencil with the note, "Negligence of the guards." But then no one paid it any attention. The prisoner climbed onto the armor. He moved slowly but confidently. The guards stood below, lazily smoking cigarettes, shielding the flames from the rain in their palms. No one climbed up after him. Who wants to get wet? And what could he do? The tank is broken. Around are towers with machine guns, a fence with electrified barbed wire, minefields. Where could he run? The Russian disappeared into the driver mechanic's hatch, and from this moment, the countdown began. What happened inside the steel box for the next 4 hours remained a secret to the Germans. They heard only metallic clanging, hammer blows, and sometimes a grinding that set teeth on edge. It seemed to them that he was simply repairing the transmission, crudely, barbarically, but repairing. But let us for a second step away from the soaked proving ground and move to the silence of a design bureau. We obtained the technical documentation of the early series Tigers. This machine had one fatal flaw, known only to the chief designers, but they were afraid to report it to Hitler. The hydraulic system responsible for turret rotation and transmission control had a common circuit with the emergency hatch locking system. This was done for water tightness during underwater driving, since the Tiger could travel along river bottoms. But there was one detail. A tiny pressure relief valve was located in a hard-to-reach place, directly under the driver mechanic's seat. If this valve were blocked, and then the engine revolutions were sharply increased to critical levels, the pressure in the system would jump not to the standard 150 atmospheres, but to 300. The tubes would not withstand it, but where would they burst? German engineers believed that the safety valve in the engine compartment would activate. Our tanker knew otherwise. He knew that the first to give way would be the connection of the pipe directly in the fighting compartment. And he knew this because he had studied captured German instructions back in '42, when he worked in evacuation on the analysis of enemy equipment. He had a phenomenal memory. He remembered the hydraulic system diagram down to the last screw. Being inside the tank in cramped quarters and semi-darkness, illuminated only by a dim bulb, he was not simply repairing the gearbox. He was turning the tank into a trap. He deliberately loosened the clamps on the hot oil pipe, directing its nozzle so that the jet would strike a specific point where the tank commander's seat was located. And that very piece of canvas was needed not for comfort. He was preparing protection for himself. Every movement of the hammer, every turn of the spanner was part of a deadly plan. He worked by feel in an oily fog, choking on fumes, but his hands worked with the precision of a neurosurgeon. He understood he would have only one attempt, one chance in a million. If the engine did not start, execution. If it started but the valve activated prematurely, he would boil alive in oil. But he had nothing to lose. Beyond the tank's walls, death or a concentration camp awaited him, which was worse than death. Here, inside, he had a ghostly hope. Outside, it was growing dark. The rain did not stop. The officers were already beginning to lose patience. Standartenführer Brunner paced nervously back and forth, his boots squelched in the mud. "How much longer will this Russian swine fiddle about?" he barked at the interpreter. The interpreter, trembling from the cold, shouted the question into the open hatch. From the bowels of the tank came a muffled voice. "Ready. Need to test." The hatch opened, and the mechanic appeared outside. He was black with oil, like the devil himself. His face glistened, his hands trembled from overexertion, but he nodded. "Tank is operational." Brunner exhaled. The tension hanging in the air eased slightly. The commandant, wanting to finish with this as quickly as possible and return to a warm office with schnapps, gave an order that became his fatal mistake. He did not order the Russian to be pulled out and his own driver seated. No, he decided that since the Russian had fixed it, let him show how it worked. Let him start it and drive a circle on the small radius. "If it stalls, shoot him," he tossed out. They ordered a crew into the tank. These were not experienced front-line soldiers, but a rear testing team. The tank commander was a young, ambitious Oberleutnant Klaus, fresh from the academy, dreaming of an Iron Cross. The gunner and loader were corporals who understood parades better than real combat. And of course, they put a guard next to the mechanic. A hefty brute with an MP-40 submachine gun who sat in the radio operator's place to the right of the driver, the muzzle of the gun pointed directly at our hero's side. The situation was hopeless. One unarmed, exhausted man surrounded by 4 enemies inside an iron box under the sights of the entire proving ground guard. What could he do? Steal the tank? Foolish. The Tiger's speed on mud was at most 20 kilometers per hour. Any motorcyclist would catch him. Knock someone out? The ammunition was training rounds, solid shot. And how would he load the gun, sitting at the levers? The Germans were calm. Too calm. They again underestimated the one who had been through the hell of the Eastern Front. The mechanic took his place. His left foot depressed the clutch. Heavy, stiff, German clutch. His right hand lay on the starter button. His heart pounded somewhere in his throat, drowning out the sound of the rain. Now or never. He pressed the button. The electric motor of the inertia starter howled, spinning up. 1 second, 2, 3. It seemed an eternity. And suddenly, bang! The engine coughed, ejecting from the exhaust pipes a cloud of thick black smoke that covered the officers on the platform, making them cough. 12 cylinders came to life. A smooth, powerful, low rumble filled the proving ground. Vibration passed through the tank's hull, transmitting into the ground. The officers, forgetting to cough, smiled. It works. German technology is back in service. They even began to applaud. Idiots. They were applauding their own death. Inside the tank, the noise was deafening. Oberleutnant Krause, through the intercom, ordered, "Move out, forward, small radius, speed 10. The guard poked the mechanic in the ribs with the gun barrel, duplicating the order with a gesture. The Russian slowly engaged first gear. The tank jerked and crawled forward. The tracks bit into the mud, grinding stones. The machine obeyed perfectly. The mechanic seemed to merge with the levers. He drove the tank smoothly, carefully. They traveled 100 meters, 200, a turn, another turn. The guards on the towers lowered their weapons. Everything was going according to plan. Just a test run. Boring. But our hero was waiting. He was waiting for a specific section of the track. There, where the road made a sharp turn at the very edge of the forest and the ground was most solid. And he was waiting for the engine to warm up to operating temperature. The oil thermometer needle slowly crept upward. 60 degrees. 70. 80. Time. He imperceptibly, to the guard, felt with his left hand under the seat for that very piece of canvas and pulled it closer. His right hand gripped the gear lever more firmly. A thought flashed through his head about home, about his wife, whom he had not seen for 2 years, about his son. Would he ever see them? Unlikely. But he would take these fascists with him. The tank was approaching the turn. Krause commanded, "Reduce throttle, turn right." And at this moment, what happened broke the script of that day and, perhaps, changed the course of the war in the minds of those who saw it. Instead of reducing throttle, the mechanic pressed the accelerator pedal to the floor, all the way. The engine roared like a wounded beast. Revolutions jumped to the red zone, 3,000 per minute. The tank lunged forward, gaining speed. "What are you doing, swine?" Krause screamed. The guard jerked, trying to raise the submachine gun, but it was too late. The mechanic sharply, with all his body weight, pulled the left friction brake toward himself, locking the track, and simultaneously shifted the transmission to a lower gear. This was a maneuver that theoretically should have torn the gearbox to shreds. The 57-ton machine, violating all laws of physics, entered a controlled skid on the mud. The tank spun 90 degrees. Centrifugal force hurled the crew inside the fighting compartment like dolls. The Oberleutnant struck his head on the gun breech. The guard dropped his submachine gun. And at that very moment, just as the Russian genius had calculated, the pressure in the hydraulic system, spurred on by the frenzied engine revolutions, reached a critical point. That same loosened clamp on the pipe broke free. It was like an explosion. A jet of superheated oil under pressure of 300 atmospheres burst into the fighting compartment. It struck exactly where the mechanic had aimed, toward the commander's and radio operator's positions. But a fraction of a second before this, the mechanic had thrown a wet, thick tarpaulin over himself, covering himself head to toe like a shield. Hell began inside the tank. Hot oil is not water, it is napalm. The German screams were drowned out by the roar of the engine. The guard, blinded and burned, began firing randomly. Bullets ricocheted inside the cramped space, striking sparks. Smoke, burning smell, the odor of charred flesh and oil filled the tank instantly. The ventilation system could not cope, and it was, in all likelihood, damaged by a stray bullet. From outside, everything looked even more terrifying. The Tiger, which a second ago had been peacefully crawling along the highway, suddenly roared, threw out a sheaf of sparks from its exhaust pipes and, performing an unthinkable pirouette, tore off not along the road, but straight across the field, toward the fence, toward the fuel and lubricant warehouses, toward freedom. Commandant Brunner dropped his binoculars. He stood with his mouth open, unable to give an order. His brain refused to believe it. It was impossible. A half-dead prisoner, a walking skeleton, had stolen the newest tank before the eyes of the entire guard. Only after 10 seconds, which seemed like an eternity, did the alarm siren wail. "Alert! Combat alert! Stop him! Shoot at the tracks!" Brunner screamed, spraying saliva. But it was already too late. The beast had broken out of its cage, and it was now controlled not by German regulations, but by Russian fury. Meanwhile, inside the steel monster, our hero threw off the tarpaulin. He was unharmed. Oil had splattered everything around, but his shelter had saved him. The guard was convulsing on the floor. The tank commander and the other crew members were either unconscious or dead. The mechanic was alone against the entire Reich. And he was smiling. A terrible smile, black with soot. He pressed the levers, feeling how the machine's power was transmitted to his hands. Ahead was barbed wire, beyond it the forest, and beyond the forest, the east, where the sun rose. And he pressed the gas even harder. A column of thick, oily smoke from the exploded fuel tank rose into the gray Brandenburg sky, serving as a kind of beacon for the entire area. But for the fugitive, this black curtain became salvation. The chaos of the first minutes, when no one understood what was happening, gave our hero a precious 500 or 600 meters head start. While the guards rushed between extinguishing the fire and trying to find keys to the weapons rooms, the Tiger was already breaking through the undergrowth, moving away from the cursed proving ground. Have you ever heard how 57 tons of metal forge their way through a young pine forest? It does not sound like an engine. It sounds like an earthquake. Trees do not simply break, they explode into splinters under the onslaught of armor. Roots fly out of the ground with a crack, and the soil trembles so much that it becomes difficult to stand on one's feet half a kilometer from the scene of events. And in this cacophony of destruction, one man was waging his own war. We found a report by the commander of the motorized guard platoon, Lieutenant von Sternberg. This document gathered dust in the Stasi archives for many years, as after the war it ended up in the Eastern occupation zone. Von Sternberg describes the chase not as a military operation, but as a hunt for a ghost. He writes that when they burst out of the gates on BMW R75 motorcycles, The track marks were clearly visible in the mud. Deep, ragged wounds on the body of the earth, filling with water. It would seem, what could be simpler? Catch up, throw grenades, stop him. A motorcycle develops a speed of up to 90 kilometers per hour. A tank through the forest at best 15. But the Germans did not take into account one psychological factor. They were pursuing not a machine. They were pursuing desperation multiplied by brilliant calculation. The Russian mechanic inside the tank understood perfectly well that in a straight line they would catch him in 10 minutes. The Tiger had enormous fuel consumption and limited running gear resources. If he came out into open operational space, onto a highway or field, he would become an easy target for aviation or anti-tank guns, which were surely already being rolled out of hangars. His only ally was the forest. The dense, ancient German forest that had kept its secrets for centuries. And he directed the machine into the thickest part, where trees stood like a wall and the ravines were so deep that even infantry could barely overcome them. He used the tank's dimensions as a weapon. Breaking trees, he created impassable blockages behind him. Trunks fell crisscross, blocking narrow paths, cutting off the motorcyclists. Von Sternberg complains in his report, "We ran into a wall of fallen pines. We had to abandon the motorcycles and run on foot. The Russian swine knew how to barricade himself on the move." Well, let us look inside the steel box. What was happening there? There are no witnesses, but there are laws of physics and anatomy. Inside the fighting compartment, hell reigned. The temperature rose to 60 degrees. Ventilation was not working. The air was saturated with carbon monoxide from the engine and the sweetish smell of spilled hydraulic oil. Next to the mechanic on the floor lay the body of the guard, who never regained consciousness. The mechanic was alone. He controlled the tank, pulling levers with hands that were burned on the hot metal. His eyes watered from the acrid smoke, but he did not stop. Do you know where he got these skills? In 1936, long before the war, at the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, secret tests of new tractors were conducted on swampy terrain. We found an award certificate in the name of a shop foreman who managed to pull a sunken prototype out of a bog when all the engineers had written off the machine. There is no surname there. It was erased by time and bureaucratic rats. But the description of the feat matches the handwriting of our fugitive. He felt the limit of the track's grip on the ground. He knew that if he gave a little more gas, the track would spin and the tank would sit on its belly. If a little less, it would stall. He was balancing on a razor's edge. After 20 minutes of pursuit, the situation changed. The Germans realized that motorcycles were useless and released half-tracks. Hanomag armored personnel carriers with infantry on board. They could pass where wheels got stuck, and they had radios. The ring was tightening. The Proving Ground Commandant, Brunner, realizing the scale of the catastrophe, sent up a light reconnaissance aircraft, a Storch. Now the fugitive was being tracked from the sky as well. But then nature itself intervened, or, if you will, Providence. A thunderstorm began, a real summer storm when the sky blackens in seconds and rain turns into a waterfall. Visibility dropped to 0. The aircraft was forced to return to base. The Tiger dissolved again in the gray veil of rain. However, the strangest thing in this story is the behavior of the Germans. Why did they not use Panzerfausts? Why, having caught up with the tank at visible distance, did they not open fire to destroy? In one of the intercepted radio messages, decrypted by British intelligence after the war, a categorical order sounds: "Take the machine intact. Shoot only at the tracks." Inside is Object 818. What is Object 818? For a long time, historians believed that this was the code name of the tank itself. But in the 1990s, An interesting detail surfaced in the archives of the Bundeswehr chemical troops. 818 is the nomenclature number of an experimental container with a new generation nerve-paralyzing gas. That very shell we mentioned in the first part. The Germans were not afraid that the Russian would steal the tank. They were afraid that a stray bullet would pierce the container inside the tank, and then the wind would spread the deadly poison for tens of kilometers, covering the nearby town of Jüterbog. Our hero became a hostage to cargo he possibly did not even suspect existed. Or did he? Remember how he covered his face with tarpaulin when he broke through the hydraulics? Maybe he found instructions. Maybe he knew that there was death in the tank and used it as insurance. If he knew that the Germans would not shoot at the hull, this freed his hands. He could ram. And he did. At the 5th kilometer of the chase, the forest parted and the tank burst onto an old logging road. Directly in front of him, blocking the way, stood an Opel Blitz truck packed with soldiers. They were setting up a checkpoint. They had an MG-42 machine gun, a terrible weapon against infantry, but useless against armor. Seeing the Hulk rushing at them, the soldiers began to scatter. The truck driver, in panic, tried to start the engine, but his hands would not obey. The Russian mechanic did not turn aside. He did not even reduce speed. 57 tons struck the Opel with such force that the truck simply ceased to exist as a single whole. It was torn apart, crushed, turned into a flat pancake of metal and wood. The Tiger passed over it like a roller over asphalt, only swaying slightly. This moment psychologically broke the pursuers. They saw not technology, they saw fury against which there was nothing to oppose. But technology has a tendency to break down. Engine oil temperature gauges were off the scale. The Maybach, running at maximum revolutions, began to misfire. The mechanic heard this uneven rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. Misfire, knock, knock. The spark plugs were flooding, or the gasket had burned through. He needed to cool the engine. But how? He could not stop. And then he performed a maneuver that could only occur to a madman. Ahead was a small river, a tributary of the Elbe, shallow but with a silty bottom. German instructions categorically forbade overcoming such obstacles without preliminary reconnaissance of the bottom and sealing, but he had no choice. He directed the tank straight into the water. Steam. Huge clouds of white steam burst from the engine compartment when the red-hot hull touched the cold water. The tank submerged up to the turret. Water began to flood the fighting compartment through cracks and bullet-pierced observation devices. But the mechanic counted on inertia and power. The tracks, equipped with wide grousers, bit into the bottom. The tank, snorting and coughing like a huge hippopotamus, crawled along the bottom. The water cooled the engine, saved it from overheating, giving it a few more hours of life. The Germans, who burst onto the bank a minute later, saw only churning water and a trail leading to the other bank into thick reeds. The armored personnel carrier stopped. They could not swim. The chase choked again. Having climbed out onto the other bank, the mechanic stopped the machine in thick willow thickets. He needed a break, at least 5 minutes. His hands were shaking so much that he could not unclench his fingers, which were gripping the levers in a death grip. He had to straighten them one by one, overcoming the cramp. He climbed onto the turret, greedily gulping the moist, cool air. Rain washed oil and soot from his face. For the first time in the last few hours, he could look around. Silence. Only the sound of rain and the crackling of cooling metal. He was alive. He was free. For now. Inside the tank remained corpses. This was heavy company, but now he was not thinking about ethics. He searched the bodies. On Lieutenant Krauss, he found a Luger pistol with 2 magazines, a bar of Coca-Cola chocolate with caffeine, a priceless energy drink for an exhausted organism, and a map
an ordinary road map of the area. The mechanic unfolded it on the wet armor, shielding it from the drizzle with his palm. He was in a triangle between Jüterbog, Luckenwald, and Barut. Deep rear. To the front line, 100 kilometers.
Breaking through to the east was unrealistic. To the west, the Allies had not yet landed. Where to go? Logic suggested he needed to abandon the conspicuous tank and make his way on foot, dissolve, become one of thousands of Ostarbeiters. But he looked at the Tiger. This machine was his trophy, his revenge, and possibly his ticket to eternity. To abandon it now meant to surrender, and he made a decision that contradicted common sense. He decided not to hide. He decided to attack. On the map was marked the Luckenwalde railway junction, a major station through which trains went to the Eastern Front. If he could get there and carry out sabotage, block the tracks for at least a day, it would be worth more than a dozen destroyed tanks. This was a kamikaze plan, but a man who had already written himself off in 1941 was not afraid of death. He was afraid of useless death. He returned to the tank. Now he needed to figure out the armament. The gun was silent. The breech block was in place, but, as we remember, there were no shells except that secret one. But there was a machine gun, coaxial with the gun, an MG-34. He checked the belt. Full. 250 rounds, that was something. And he also found under the radio operator's seat a box with N-24 hand grenades. Those same stick grenades. Apparently the crew had taken them for training throws. 6 pieces. Not much, but enough for one good fight. Meanwhile, at the district headquarters, real panic arose. Information about the escaped tank reached Berlin. Himmler, learning of the incident, flew into a rage. The fact that a Russian Untermensch had stolen top-secret technology undermined the very foundation of Nazi ideology about racial superiority. An order was given to raise the alarm for an SS training tank division quartered 60 kilometers away. Against one tank, an entire army was being deployed. The hunt was moving to a new level. Now it was not a police operation, but a military one. Reinforced checkpoints with 88mm anti-aircraft guns were set up on the roads. The forest began to be combed by chains of Jaegers with dogs. The sky, as soon as the rain ended, filled with Junkers. The ring was tightening with mathematical inevitability. But our hero knew the forest better than they thought. He moved not along roads, he went along high-voltage line clearings, along the beds of dried-up streams. He drove the machine so carefully, as if it had a crystal heart. Every pothole, every stump he bypassed, conserving the suspension's resources. He listened to the engine like a musician listens to an instrument, catching the slightest false note. And the machine responded to him in kind. The German beast recognized its Russian master. Closer to nightfall, he came out to the edge of a small village. He needed fuel.
The Tiger's tanks held 534 liters, but consumption off-road was monstrous, up to 5 liters per kilometer. The fuel level needle was inexorably crawling toward zero. In the village, judging by the map, there was a machine tractor station. The risk was colossal, but without gasoline, the tank would turn into a pile of metal in 10 kilometers. He shut off the engine at the forest edge and began to observe. The village was quiet. Somewhere a dog was barking. There was no light. Blackout was strictly observed. He took a canister found in the tank, the lieutenant's pistol, and a knife. He climbed out through the lower evacuation hatch so as not to make noise with the turret lid. Like a shadow, he slipped toward the first houses. Here, his scout skills, acquired back in the Finnish campaign, came in handy. He moved silently, merging with the darkness. The smell of manure and stove smoke. Peaceful life, so distant and so close. At the machine tractor station stood a solitary tractor,
and a barrel with the inscription, gasoline. There was no guard. Apparently, no one expected an enemy in the heart of Germany. He filled the canister, 20 liters. This was a drop in the ocean. He needed more. He found a cart, loaded onto it 2 more barrels of 200 liters each. The weight was incredible, but adrenaline works wonders. He rolled the cart toward the forest. The squeak of wheels seemed to him like the roar of an artillery barrage. Every meter was given with a fight. His heart pounded so hard it echoed in his temples. When he was already approaching the forest, the door of the last house opened. An old man with a lantern came out onto the threshold. A German burgher came out to check why the dog was barking. The beam of the lantern picked out the figure of a man in dirty overalls pushing a cart. The old man froze. He saw our hero's face, the face of a man who had been through hell. There was so much pain and determination in that gaze that the German did not cry out. He simply lowered the lantern and silently returned to the house, locking the door. Why did he not raise the alarm? Perhaps he took him for a ghost, or simply decided that he wanted to live more than to be a hero. This will remain a mystery. Returning to the tank, the mechanic poured in the fuel. It was hellish work, lifting 200-liter barrels onto the armor alone. He used a lever made from dead wood, tore his sinews, roared from the strain. But he did it. Full tank. Now he had a range of another 100 kilometers. 100 kilometers of freedom, or 100 kilometers of war. He took the driver-mechanic's seat again. Fatigue descended like a leaden blanket. His eyes closed by themselves. His body demanded sleep, but he could not sleep. Sleep meant death. He bit off a piece of chocolate, washed it down with rainwater. The bitterness of caffeine cleared his consciousness a little. Forward, only forward. The tank moved off, but now it was not hiding. It came out onto the asphalt highway leading to Luckenwalde. The tracks crushed the asphalt, striking sparks. Speed increased to 40 kilometers per hour. This was a challenge, a bold, brazen challenge to the entire military machine of the Reich. It was as if he was saying, "I am here. Try to take me." And they accepted the challenge. In the distance, on the horizon, headlights appeared, a long column. They were coming towards him. This was the vanguard of that very SS tank division. Panthers, armored personnel carriers, self-propelled guns. Force against force, one against a legion. But he was not going to die in a frontal attack. He had prepared a surprise for them. The peculiarity of the terrain in this area lay in the system of drainage canals running along the road, deep ditches with water. If you dumped equipment in there, it would be impossible to pull it out without a crane.
And our tactician decided to play bowling. Steel bowling, where German tanks would be the pins and his captured Tiger the ball. He switched off the headlights. The tank turned into a black phantom racing through the night. The German column was traveling with full lights, confident in its safety. They did not see him until the last moment. When the distance closed to 200 meters, he suddenly switched on the searchlight, directing it straight into the windscreen of the lead truck. A blinding beam of light pierced the darkness. The truck driver instinctively jerked the wheel to the left, and this triggered a chain reaction of catastrophe. Military historians still argue about how one tank, without a single shot from its gun, managed to stop a mechanized column and turn the night highway into a graveyard of equipment. Some call it luck, others brilliant calculation. But what happened in the next 5 minutes is worthy of the pen of Hollywood's best screenwriters. Although this was the harsh, dirty, and bloody reality of 1943, and this reality surpassed the boldest fantasies. Have you ever seen what happens when 57 tons of hardened steel, moving at 40 kilometers per hour,
meets a column of light armored vehicles that does not expect it. Forensic investigators working at the scene on the highway near Luckenwalde 2 days later described what they saw in one word: meat grinder. But this was not just an accident. It was a surgically precise execution. We gained access to the protocols of the scene examination compiled by the field gendarmerie. The tracks on the asphalt tell a story that is impossible to believe unless you see the photographs. The Tiger did not just ram, it danced. At the moment when the lead truck of the German column, blinded by the searchlight, swerved left and plunged into the drainage canal, the formation fell apart.
The drivers of the vehicles behind, seeing a wall of light and flying debris before them, hit the brakes. This became their sentence. Heavy half-tracked tractors, guns, fuel tankers, all of this mixed into a heap. And into this heap at full speed crashed our fugitive. He used the inertia of his machine as a ram. The first blow struck the side of a Marder self-propelled gun. The report states that from the impact, the 75mm gun of the self-propelled gun bent at a right angle, and the machine itself was thrown 20 meters like a toy. But the mechanic did not stop. He knew that stopping meant death. He engaged reverse gear, turned the tank on the spot, grinding the asphalt to dust, and struck again. This time the target was a communications armored personnel carrier. Why communications specifically? This proves that sitting at the levers was not a prisoner crazed with fear, but a cold tactician. By destroying the vehicle with antennas, he deprived the column of the ability to call for reinforcements. Silence fell on the airwaves. Only the crackle of burning metal and the screams of the wounded. In the chaos of the night battle, in smoke and flame, the Germans began shooting at each other. They saw the silhouette of a tank but could not understand whether it was friend or foe. After all, it was a Tiger, their own machine. This second of confusion cost them their lives. Our hero passed through the column like a red-hot knife through butter, leaving behind a trail of destruction, and again dissolved into the night, turning onto a dirt road leading to the railway tracks. Well, let us step away from the description of the battle and turn to a document we found in the archives of the Reich Railway Administration. This is a report from the station master of Jüterbog, dated the early morning of the 26th of July. It speaks of an unidentified object that was moving along the tracks with its headlights off. The railway workers took it for a shunting locomotive, but the sound was different. It was the low, guttural roar of a 12-cylinder engine running at its limit. The tank was traveling on a parallel course with a freight train carrying coal. Why? The answer lies in the temperature regime of the Maybach engine. After the frantic chase and ramming, the coolant temperature again approached the critical mark of 110 degrees. The engine was boiling. It needed to cool down, but stopping was impossible. Behind, just 5 kilometers away, the main forces of the SS Death's Head Division were already deploying. And then the mechanic came up with a trick that is not described in any manual. He tucked himself into the aerodynamic shadow of the train. The long train, traveling at 50 kilometers per hour, created behind it a powerful airflow, a kind of vacuum pocket, moving close to the last wagon, practically touching it with the gun barrel. The tank received additional cooling due to turbulence, and at the same time the noise of the train masked the clatter of the tracks. This was a game with death. One wrong movement of the lever, and the tank would crash into the wagon, derail, or tear a track. But he held the distance kilometer after kilometer in complete darkness, navigating only by the haze and the red lantern of the tail wagon. However, luck cannot last forever. At dawn, the fog lifted, and in the sky appeared a sound that every soldier of that war knows: the nasty, whining howl of Junker's 87 dive bombers. Stukas. The Germans had raised aviation.
Now that they knew the approximate search area, detecting a huge tank in open terrain was a matter of minutes. Luftwaffe pilots, aces who had been through France and Stalingrad, were looking for their prey. A tank against a green field, an ideal target.
Inside the Tiger, our hero heard this sound. He looked through the periscope. 2 black dots in the sky were growing rapidly. He had no anti-aircraft machine gun. He had no shells. He had only his brain and knowledge of the machine. He knew that a bomb weighing 250 kilograms, even falling nearby, would overturn the tank or tear the tracks. A direct hit would turn him into a mass grave. He would not have time to run to the forest. The forest was 2 kilometers away. Only one thing remained: to deceive. In the Tiger's exhaust system, there was a possibility of feeding fuel directly into the red-hot manifolds to create a smoke screen. But the standard screen is white. It tells the enemy, "I am here. I am hiding." The mechanic did something else. He opened the engine compartment hatch from inside. Yes, there was a technical hatch in the partition for maintenance, and he splashed the remains of oil directly onto the red-hot cylinder heads. Thick, black, greasy smoke poured from all the cracks in the engine compartment. From the outside, it looked as if the tank had already been knocked out and was burning. He shut down the engine. The tank froze in the middle of the field, spewing clouds of blackness. The mechanic himself almost suffocated. He put on the gas mask found on the dead lieutenant and froze. The planes came in on a combat course. The lead pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Ulrich, the surname in the report is smudged, but we can guess who it is, reported by radio, "Target in sight. Target destroyed. Heavy smoke, burning with open flame. Canceling attack. Conserving ammunition." They believed it. The Germans, accustomed to patterns, decided that someone else had already done the work for them, or that the Russian tank's engine had simply exploded from overload. The planes made a victory lap and returned to base. When the roar of the engines died away, the dead tank came to life. But now it had a new problem, the most terrible of all: fuel. The gauge was at 0. Those barrels he had filled in the village had burned in the furnace of the forced march. The tank stopped. Now, finally, 57 tons of useless metal in the middle of enemy country. It would seem the finale. Open the hatch, get out, and accept the last battle with a pistol in hand. But our hero would not be a legend if he had surrendered. He climbed onto the turret. Silence. The morning sun illuminated an idyllic landscape. Neat German farms, windmills, and a smell. The sweetish smell of mash, alcohol. The wind was blowing from the direction of a small factory with a tall brick chimney located in a hollow about 500 meters away. On the map captured from the officer, this object was not marked. But you cannot fool a Russian man's nose. This was a schnapps factory, or a plant for producing synthetic fuel from potatoes and coal. In Germany, at the end of the war, this was a common phenomenon. The Maybach petrol engine was omnivorous. If you knew how to adjust the carburetor, it could run on low-octane petrol, but could it run on alcohol? Theoretically, yes. Practically, it killed the engine's service life in a matter of hours. But he did not need hours. He needed kilometers. He left the tank. Leaving the machine was frightening, but necessary. With an empty canister, he crawled through the potato field to the factory. The guard there was nominal. A couple of old men from the Volkssturm with hunting rifles. They were guarding the alcohol from their own workers, not from Soviet saboteurs. Penetration of the factory territory is worthy of a separate spy novel. He did not kill the guards. He bypassed them, using shadows and folds of terrain. He found a cistern with finished product. Technical ethanol 96 degrees. Flammable,
from which any engine would howl, but it would run. He filled the canister, returned to the tank, poured it in, returned again.
7 trips, 140 liters. This would be enough to start and reach the factory itself to refuel fully. When the Tiger, on alcohol fuel, coughing and shooting fire from the exhaust pipes, alcohol burns differently than petrol, drove through the factory gates, the guards scattered without a single shot. The sight of the smoking, roaring monster with red stars, he had drawn them in mud on the turret while waiting for the engine to cool, a psychological move, caused panic terror. He drove the tank right under the drain tap of the cistern, opened the tank necks. Alcohol gushed inside, and then the unforeseen happened. In the factory office, a telephone rang. The mechanic, standing on the armor, heard this call through the open window. He jumped down, ran into the building. The receiver hung on a cord. He picked it up. At the other end of the line was a calm, authoritative voice. The voice spoke in Russian, with a slight, almost imperceptible accent. 4312. I know you can hear me. You have come far, but alcohol will destroy the cylinder head gaskets in 20 kilometers. You will not reach the Elbe. Surrender. I give my word as an officer that I will spare your life. We need people like you. Who was this? How did they know he was at the factory? So they had been watching him. So that stork in the sky was not the only observer, or was there actually a radio beacon on the tank? This thought pierced him like an electric shock. A beacon, of course, an experimental model. The Germans could not release it to the testing ground without insurance. He dropped the receiver, ran out to the tank, began feverishly examining the stern. Where could they have hidden the transmitter? Under the niche, in the spare parts box, he tore off boxes, scattered tools, and found it. A small black box with an antenna, magnetized inside the exhaust pipe casing, where the temperature was lowest. He tore it off, threw it on the ground, and crushed it with the track, turning the tank. Now they were blind, but they knew where he had been a minute ago. Time began counting in seconds. He squeezed everything he could from the factory, full tanks of alcohol. The engine ran roughly with a metallic clang. Detonation was terrible, but the power. On alcohol, the Maybach produced not 700, but all 800 horsepower, even though it was consuming itself. The tank shot off so that cobblestones flew from under the tracks. Now his goal was not just escape. In the telephone conversation, he had caught in the background noise, the noise of a station, an announcer's announcement. Special purpose train arriving at platform 1. The voice of the caller was from Luckenwalde, from that very railway junction he had been aiming for initially. They were waiting for him there. They thought they had blocked all roads. But they did not take into account that he now had fuel that allowed the tank to fly. He did not go by road. He went along the embankment. A railway embankment is an ideal road for a tank. Level, straight, elevated above the terrain. No mines, no ambushes. The Germans do not mind their tracks in the deep rear. In an hour, chimneys and spires of Luckenwalde appeared on the horizon. The city lived its rear area life. Locomotives smoked, trucks rumbled. The mechanic stopped the tank in a copse a kilometer from the station. He needed a plan. A frontal attack on a fortified junction was suicide. There were surely 88s there that would pierce the Tiger through and through. He needed cunning. He remembered that very experimental shell, the container with gas we spoke of. It still lay in the rack. If the marking was to be believed, this was a binary gas. 2 components, safe separately, lethal when mixed. But how to use it? He had no fuse. And then his gaze fell on the smoke discharge system he had already used. What if, instead of oil,
He poured one of the gas components into the system. When heated, it would evaporate and create a cloud, not lethal but causing panic, suffocation, tears. This would disperse the infantry and gun crews. This would give him a corridor. He began to improvise right in the field, opening the sealed container with the captured knife, risking chemical burns to his lungs. His hands trembled, but not from fear, but from tension. He poured the thick, yellowish liquid into the smoke discharge container, started up. Now he was going all in. The Tiger came out onto the home straight. It entered the city from the freight station side. People on the platforms froze. A dirty, sooty tank without identification marks, with bent fenders, roaring like a dragon. When the station guard came to their senses and opened fire with rifles, he pressed the smoke discharge button. From the rear of the tank burst forth not a black, but an acrid yellow cloud. The wind carried it towards the anti-aircraft gunners' positions. The effect was instantaneous. Soldiers abandoned their guns, clutching at their throats, covering their eyes with their hands. Panic, gas, chemical attack. This cry was more terrifying than bombardment. The tank passed through the yellow fog like a ghost. It rolled out onto the station square. Directly before it stood that very special purpose train, armored carriages, platforms with covered equipment, and a staff salon carriage with large windows. The mechanic saw through the carriage window a group of officers. They were sitting over a map. Among them was a man in civilian clothing, but with military bearing, the very same one who had telephoned. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second. In the German's eyes was not fear, but astonishment. He had seen someone he believed to be dead. Our hero did not fire the machine gun. He directed the 50-ton machine straight at the middle of the train, at the coupling between the staff carriage and the armored platform. The impact was of such force that the carriage was thrown into the air. The tank, crashing into the steel frame, became stuck. The engine stalled. The coupling burst. The train was torn in half. The path was blocked. The sabotage had succeeded, but now he was trapped. The tank was stuck in the wreckage of the carriage, surrounded by enemies who were already donning gas masks and recovering their senses. The turret was blocked by a piece of the carriage roof. It could not be rotated. The machine gun pointed at the sky. He heard how outside studded boots were stamping. He heard commands. "Take him alive! Smoke him out!" Someone began hammering on the hatch with a rifle butt. "Russian! Surrender!" At this moment, the mechanic looked at the temperature gauge. The needle had gone into the red zone and frozen. There, from overheating and impact, something had happened in the fuel system. The smell of alcohol became unbearable inside the fighting compartment. One spark would be sufficient. He took out the last stick grenade, unscrewed the cap. The cord with the porcelain ball fell into his palm. He looked at it, then at the hatch, which they were already beginning to break open with a crowbar. He had a choice: pull the cord and blow himself up together with the tank and those outside. Or he suddenly remembered another detail from the instructions: the emergency hatch in the floor. It opened inward, but the tank was hanging on the wreckage of the carriage. The floor was raised above the ground. There, below, beneath the tracks, it was dark. The space between the rails. He quietly, trying not to clink metal, unscrewed the wing nuts securing the hatch. The cover was heavy, about 20 kilograms. He took it onto his chest, lowered it to the floor. The black opening led into the unknown. Outside, they had already brought a gas cutter. The flame hissed. The metal of the hatch began to glow red. The mechanic exhaled, crossed himself, although he was a party member, and slithered like a snake into the hole. He fell onto the ballast directly beneath the tank.
Above him hung 57 tons of steel and hundreds of liters of alcohol, ready to ignite. Around him, boots were running, dogs were barking, choking on saliva. But the dogs sensed the smell of alcohol and gas, which overpowered the smell of a human. He crawled on his belly beneath the carriages, between the wheel sets, in oil, in dirt, to where the train ended, towards the coal depot. At this time, an explosion sounded from above. The alcohol vapors in the fighting compartment had detonated from a spark from the cutter. The tank's turret was torn off and thrown a meter into the air. The Germans standing on the armor were swept away by the blast wave. Everyone decided that the Russian had blown himself up.
The city commandant, looking at the burning remains of the Tiger, removed his peaked cap. "A worthy enemy," he muttered. Case closed. The prisoner perished, all traces destroyed. But they did not know that 100 meters from them, from a pile of coal, a pair of eyes was observing all this. Eyes in which there was no longer that merry spark that had been there at the beginning. There was cold ice there. He was free from the tank, but now he was alone in the center of Germany, without weapons. The submachine gun had remained in the machine. With him only a pistol and a knife, without food, in clothing soaked with chemicals and oil, and with a task that had become even more difficult: to survive and return to tell the truth. And the truth lay in what he had seen in that torn-apart carriage. While he was getting out, his gaze had caught on scattered papers from the safe. On one of the folders was a classification stamp that made him go cold.
This was not simply a map of military operations. This was a diagram of the location of underground factories, and one of them was located beneath this very station. He understood that his war had not ended. It had only begun, and now he would have to descend underground into the kingdom of darkness, where the Reich was forging its final weapon of retribution. Have you ever heard of Project Mole? No, not about the animal and not about spy games from the Cold War era. This concerns the Reich's construction program, encrypted under Index B4. For a long time, historians believed that underground factories existed only in the Harz Mountains, where V-2 rockets were produced. But documents found by us in the private archive of a former employee of the Imperial Railway Administration indicate that beneath Luckenwalde Station was located an object about which they were afraid to speak even at the Nuremberg trials. It was there, into this concrete womb of war, that our hero descended. He left behind the burning remains of the Tiger, transforming from a tank man into a shadow gliding through the arteries of German industry. The descent underground was not like heroic scenes from action films. This was a dirty, agonizing process, crawling through an inclined coal chute that led to the boiler room of the underground complex. Imagine a narrow black pipe covered with coal dust, where the air is stale and hot. A man who had just survived a tank battle now had to struggle with an attack of claustrophobia. His lungs, already burned by alcohol vapors and chemicals, greedily caught every gulp of oxygen. But he crawled downward, into the darkness, to where came a low-frequency hum that made his teeth vibrate. This hum was the breathing of giant generators. We found the ventilation diagram of this level. It staggers the imagination. The Germans built beneath the ground an autonomous city with its own microclimate. And so our fugitive tumbles out of the coal-feed hatch into an enormous room resembling the underworld. But here it is not devils roasting sinners, but thousands of emaciated people in striped robes servicing giant furnaces. This is the boiler heart of the complex. Here it is so noisy that a person's cry cannot be heard even from 2 paces away. This saved him. No one paid attention to the figure that had fallen from the technical hatch and hidden behind a mountain of anthracite. He was black with soot, like everyone here. Perfect camouflage. However, his goal was not the boiler room. He was driven forward by that very document seen in the torn-apart carriage.
Sector Z, Laboratory. He made his way along technical walkways hanging beneath the very ceiling among the tangle of pipes and cables. From above opened a view that could drive one mad. Enormous workshops hewn in the rock. Bright, sterile electric light flooded rows of machine tools, behind which stood not prisoners, but German specialists in white coats. Here they were assembling something strange. These were not tanks, these were engines, but unusual Maybachs. These were gas turbine units, compact, monstrously powerful. The very ones which, according to the designer's plan, were supposed to be installed in next-generation tanks, E-Series. Our hero froze on a metal beam, gripping a handrail. His engineer's brain, despite monstrous fatigue, began to analyze what he saw. He understood the connection. That Tiger which he had stolen was a test stand. That was precisely why it had such a transmission. And that very vulnerability in the hydraulics. It was calculated for different pressure, for different revolutions, for the revolutions of a turbine, not a piston engine. Everything fell into place. They had made him repair not simply a tank, but a prototype cooling system for this monster. And that was precisely why they had pursued him so. He was the bearer of a secret that could change the balance of forces in tank warfare. If the Soviet Union had learned that the Germans were close to creating a gas turbine tank in 1943, this would have caused shock in the Kremlin. He needed to find blueprints or a sample. But how? He was alone, without weapons. The pistol had remained in the boiler room. It had hindered crawling. Against an entire garrison of SS guards who controlled every corridor. But he had a weapon more terrible than a pistol. His knowledge. He looked at the system of pipelines entwining the workshop. Yellow pipes, gas, blue, oxygen, red, fire suppression. German pedantry and color coding. They had made the system comprehensible to any literate engineer, and this became their sentence. He noticed that the main air duct of the air conditioning system passed directly above the control section, a glazed aquarium where the management sat. There, behind the glass, he saw a familiar silhouette. The man in civilian clothing, the very same one who had telephoned the factory. He stood at an enormous drawing board and was furiously proving something to a group of military men. On the table before them lay that very map, a copy of which our hero had. But now he saw the original. And on the original were marked not only factories, there were marked routes. Routes for delivering something very important to the Kursk Bulge area. Our saboteur made a decision. He could not destroy the entire factory. He had no explosives. But he could stop the heart of this organism. He could arrange oxygen starvation for them in both the literal and figurative sense. He began to make his way to the gas distribution node. This was the most complex acrobatics. He had to jump from pipe to pipe at a height of 20 meters above the concrete floor. One wrong movement, one slippery sole, and he would be smashed to death. His hands were trembling. His muscles were cramping. He was at the limit of human physiological capabilities. We found medical reports on the condition of fighter pilots after prolonged battles. They recorded weight loss of up to 5 kilograms per sortie and tremor of the extremities. Our hero had been in such a state for the second day, but he was driven by anger. Cold, calculating fury of a professional from whom everything had been taken except the right to revenge. Having reached the ventilation node, he discovered what he was looking for: the mixing chamber. Here, air from the surface was cleaned, heated, and supplied to the clean rooms of the laboratory, and nearby ran a main line with technical nitrogen, which they used for cooling welding. If nitrogen were supplied into the ventilation system instead of air, people would simply fall asleep. Quietly, without panic. Nitrogen has no smell. This is called death in euphoria, an insidious but effective plan. But for this, it was necessary to cross-connect the valves. Suddenly a whistle sounded below. Guards. Had someone noticed the shadow beneath the ceiling? No, this was the changing of the guard. Soldiers with dogs were passing directly beneath him. Dobermans, intelligent, vicious creatures. One of the dogs stopped, raised its muzzle, and began drawing in air. It had sensed a stranger. The smell of sweat, burning, and fear, which, like it or not, any person emits. The dog growled. The guard jerked the leash, looked upward, but the bright lamps blinded him. He saw nothing in the dark tangle of communications. "Hans, let's go. There are only rats here," shouted the second guard. The soldiers left. Our hero exhaled. Drops of cold sweat fell from his forehead onto the hot pipe, instantly evaporating with a hiss. He took out his only tool, a trophy knife. The blade was of Solingen steel. He needed to unscrew 4 bolts on the flange connecting the pipes. The bolts were painted over, seized up.
To unscrew them with a knife was an impossible task. But he remembered physics. Leverage. He found a piece of metal reinforcement bar forgotten by workers. He inserted the knife into the gap, leaned with his whole body. The metal creaked. The first bolt moved, the second, the third. On the fourth, the knife blade crunched and broke. The fragment remained in the bolt. Catastrophe. No, the flange had already loosened. Gas under pressure began to escape with a whistle. Now the most difficult thing was to direct the stream of nitrogen into the air intake. He used his robe, removed his jacket, remaining in a dirty undershirt, wrapped the place of the rupture, creating an improvised sleeve, and shoved its end into the ventilation grill, which he had previously broken out with a kick. The pressure was enormous. The fabric swelled like a sail. Nitrogen went into the system. Now he had 10 minutes, no more, until the oxygen concentration in the offices fell to critical, until the Germans understood what was happening. He needed to descend there, into the aquarium, for the documents. The way down was faster but more dangerous. He slid down the fire ladder, burning his palms. He found himself in the corridor of the administrative block. Here it was quiet. Too quiet. Carpet runners muffled footsteps. On the walls hung portraits of the Führer. He walked, staggering like a drunk man. Hypoxia was beginning to affect him too, because the gas leak was nearby. His eyes were darkening. He pushed the door with the sign, Chief Designer. Inside sat people, that very man in the suit and 2 generals. They sat in armchairs, their heads lowered onto their chests. It seemed they were sleeping. Nitrogen had done its work. No agony, no struggle. Simply the light switch in the brain had clicked off. Our hero approached the table.
His hands would not obey. His fingers were like wood.
He grabbed the folder with a red stripe diagonally. On the cover was stamped, "For command only." He opened it, and what he saw made him forget about fatigue. These were not simply engine blueprints. This was correspondence. Letters from the Soviet Union, dated 1939 and 1940. Technical exchange. It turned out that part of the turbine developments had been transferred to the Germans within the framework of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but they had used them not for peaceful tractors, but for creating a doomsday weapon. And in one of the letters, a surname was mentioned. His surname. The German engineer wrote, "Russian specialist K possesses unique intuition in questions of gas dynamics. I recommend involving him in the work at any cost." So that was it. They were hunting him not because he had stolen a tank. They had arranged the tank breakdown to test him. This entire spectacle at the proving ground, the non-working transmission. This was a test, an examination. If he had not repaired the tank, they would not have shot him. They would have sent him here, to this underground laboratory, but already as a slave engineer. But he, with his escape, had broken their game. The realization of this fact struck him harder than a rifle butt.
He had been a pawn in the game of intelligence services, but had decided to become a queen. Suddenly, the telephone on the desk rang. A sharp, piercing ring in the dead silence of the office. Our hero started. He looked at the sleeping or dead owner of the office, then at the telephone. Who could be calling? Guards. They had noticed the drop in oxygen level on the sensors. The door to the corridor flew open. On the threshold stood an SS officer in a gas mask. He held a parabellum in his hands. Seeing the Russian, he did not shout, "Hands up!" He fired. The bullet struck his shoulder. The pain was blinding, hot.
Our hero fell, overturning the heavy oak desk. The folder with documents scattered across the floor. The officer stepped inside, raising the pistol for the finishing shot, but he did not take one thing into account. The desk was massive. The Russian struck the desk leg with his healthy leg, pushing it at the German. The heavy furniture knocked the officer off his feet. A struggle began. A brutal, dirty struggle on the office floor. A wounded, exhausted prisoner against a well-fed, trained SS man. Shackled by a gas mask, the mask limited visibility. This gave a chance. Our hero seized with his healthy hand the corrugated tube of the gas mask and yanked it. The rubber burst. The German convulsively gasped, and his lungs filled with air that contained almost no oxygen. Instead, it was 90% nitrogen. He wheezed. His movements became sluggish. Within a minute, he fell silent. Our hero rose, clutching the wound with his hand. Blood flowed through his fingers, dark, thick. He was losing strength with each second. He needed to leave. But how? In the corridor, the stomp of boots could already be heard. The alarm was now real. He looked at the wall of the office. A large communications diagram hung there. He searched for an exit. Not to the surface. They were waiting for him there. He searched for a way down, into the drainage system, into the sewers, which, according to the diagram, emptied into the Nutya River a kilometer from here. This was the way of rats. But now he was a rat, cornered. He gathered the scattered documents and stuffed them inside his shirt where the tarpaulin had been before. Blood soaked the papers. Symbolic. Blood for a secret. He approached the office window overlooking the workshop and smashed the glass with a chair. Below in the workshop, panic was beginning. Workers were falling, guards were rushing about. Chaos. His best friend. He climbed out onto the ledge. Height again, risk again. But now with a shot shoulder. Each meter was given with a cry of pain that stuck in his throat. He descended along the drain pipe, slippery and wet. His hands kept slipping. Having descended to level -2, he found a storm drain hatch, a heavy cast-iron cover. He could not lift it with one hand. He used the officer's belt, which he had taken with him. He made a loop, threw it over the hatch bracket, threaded his leg through, and using his body weight, moved the cover. The musty smell of the underground struck his nose. This was the smell of freedom. He dove into the darkness, sliding the cover back behind him. Exactly at the moment when flashlight beams appeared in the corridor. He went into the collector. "Close the sluices," Amkoy heard the order from above. Sluices. That meant they could flood the tunnels. The game continued. Now not only the army was against him, but also water. He waded knee-deep through icy slush. The darkness was absolute. He had no flashlight. He walked by feel, running his healthy hand along the slimy wall. He counted steps. According to the map, which he had memorized with photographic memory during those seconds in the office, it was 300 meters to the first junction. Suddenly, a rumble sounded behind him, the growing noise of water. They had opened the sluices. A wave was coming after him. He ran. He ran, stumbling, falling into filth, getting up and running again. The water rose to his waist, to his chest. The current knocked him off his feet.
The cold penetrated to his bones, paralyzing his will. But ahead, light began to glimmer. The weak gray light of a water discharge grate. An exit. He lunged with his last strength. Water was already flooding his throat. He grabbed the bars of the grate. It was locked, welded shut. A dead end. The water pressed him against the grate. The pressure was increasing.
He looked through the bars at the gray river water, at the sky covered with clouds, so close and so unattainable. He began to scream, screaming from helplessness and rage. And then he noticed that one of the bars, the lower one, had rusted through. Years of water and chemicals had done their work. He braced his feet against the concrete edges of the pipe, grabbed with both hands the wounded and the healthy, and pulled. The pain in his shoulder was such that he nearly lost consciousness. Stars exploded in his eyes, but the metal gave way. The bar bent. A gap formed, narrow, about 30 centimeters. Would he fit through? He exhaled all the air from his lungs to reduce the volume of his chest and squeezed through the hole. The water pushed him out into the river like a cork from a bottle. He surfaced, greedily gulping air. The current caught him and carried him away from the cursed factory, from the city, from the pursuit. He was alive. The documents were with him, but he was on the verge of death from hypothermia and blood loss. The shore was overgrown with reeds. He crawled onto dry land like a primitive creature and fell into the mud. He had no strength even to turn over onto his back. And at that moment, a shadow bent over him, a person, a beast. He tried to lift his head but could not. The last thing he heard before falling into oblivion was German speech, but not the bark of commands. It was a child's voice.
"Mama, look, there's a soldier here. He's dead."
And a woman's voice, quiet, frightened.
"Hush, Marta, this is not our soldier. My God, look at his hand."
Have you ever wondered why German police reports from the end of July 1943 concerning the Brandenburg district show an anomalous spike in reports of missing civilian clothing and medications? Official history attributed this to deserters and guest workers fleeing from farms, but we found a diary that lay in the attic of a half-ruined house in the suburb of Luckenwalde for more than 60 years. Its author, Frau Hilda Schmidt, widow of a Wehrmacht officer killed at Stalingrad, describes events that do not fit into the official picture of the world at that time. She writes of a ghost who fell from the Nutya River at sunset on July 27th. This ghost was covered with mud, smelled of chemicals and death, and black blood oozed from his shoulder. But the most terrible thing, the ghost had the eyes of a man who had seen hell and returned. When Hilda and her 5-year-old daughter Marta found our hero on the shore, he was in a state of clinical death. Hypothermia, blood loss, toxic shock from nitrogen and alcohol fumes. Any normal German woman of that time should have run to the police. For harboring an enemy, the entire family would be shot. But Hilda did not run. Why? Historians still argue. Some speak of reverse Stockholm syndrome. Others of secret hatred for the Nazi regime that took her husband from her. But we lean toward the version voiced by a forensic psychologist who studied her records. She saw in this broken, half-dead Russian not an enemy, but a mirror of her grief. She saw a victim of the same thresher that had ground up her life. She and her daughter, who, fortunately, was too small to understand party politics, dragged the body into an old tobacco drying barn. This structure stood on the outskirts, far from the road. What happened next can be called a miracle of folk medicine. Hilda had no penicillin. She had no surgical instruments. She washed the wound with schnapps. Irony of fate, since it was schnapps that had nearly killed our hero in the tank. and she cauterized it with heated iron. In her diary, she writes, "He did not even scream. He only ground his teeth so that I thought they would crumble. He was delirious, speaking in an incomprehensible language, but he repeated one word constantly: map, map, map. For 3 days he lay in fever. For 3 days Hilda walked on a knife's edge. In the village, they already knew about the sabotage at the station and at the factory. The Gestapo was turning the earth. Trucks with soldiers were combing every yard. And then came the moment of truth. The morning of July 30th. A black Opel drove up to Hilda's house. 2 men in leather coats and the local police chief got out. They were not just looking for a fugitive. They were looking for an especially dangerous terrorist who possessed state secrets. Our hero at this time was conscious. He lay under a pile of old straw on the second tier of the barn, clutching in his hand that very knife with the broken blade. He heard footsteps below. He heard the police chief ask Hilda if she had seen any suspicious persons. He heard the barn door creak. Imagine the tension of this moment. One of the Gestapo men began to poke the haystack with a bayonet, methodically, section by section. The blade passed centimeters from the fugitive's body. Our hero held his breath. His heart was beating so loudly that it seemed this pounding could be heard throughout all of Brandenburg. He was calculating options. If the bayonet went into his leg, he would not make a sound. If into his stomach, the same. But if they found him? He had no strength for a fight. He was as weak as a child. At that moment, his life depended not on his hand-to-hand combat skills, but on chance and on a little girl. Marta, Hilda's daughter, suddenly began to cry loudly in the yard, having dropped her doll into the well. This distracted the Germans. The Gestapo man cursed, threw down the pitchfork, and went out. They left.
When the sound of the engine died away, Hilda climbed upstairs. She brought him her husband's clothes, a gray civilian suit, a cap, work boots. She understood that he had to leave. His presence was a death sentence for her and her child. Our hero, staggering, stood up. For the first time in these days, he looked at himself in a shard of mirror nailed to a beam. An emaciated face, sunken eyes. But the gaze remained the same. This was the gaze of a wolf that had licked its wounds and was ready to go hunting again. He pulled out from under the hay the most valuable thing, the folder with documents. The paper had dried, but bloodstains and river water had made some lines unreadable. However, the diagram remained, and studying it by the light breaking through the cracks, he understood a terrible thing. The factory in Luckenwalde was only a node, an assembly shop. But the components, turbine blades, were manufactured in Czechoslovakia, heat-resistant alloys in the Ruhr.
And the testing ground for finished products was not in Germany. It was in Poland, in an area that on the map was marked with a thick red marker with the notation, Zone of Complete Exclusion, Blizna. That was where the trains were going. And that was where, according to the correspondence, the first combat use of the product was planned. Not a tank. The tank was only a carrier. It was about something that was mounted on a chassis, about a generator. A generator of what? The texts were full of terms like directed resonance, ultrasonic circuit. Were the Germans creating a sonic cannon or something that kills with vibrations at a distance? This changed everything. He could not simply flee to his own side and report about a new tank. That would be a half-truth. He needed to get to Blizna, to the heart of darkness. How? On foot across half of Europe with a shot shoulder? Impossible. He needed transport, and not just a car that would be stopped at the first checkpoint. He needed transport that was going there officially. A train. He left Hilda's house at night. He did not say thank you.
Words were unnecessary. He simply left on the table a gold watch taken from the hand of that Lieutenant Krause killed in the tank. This was payment for life. A gesture worthy of a gentleman, but performed by a ghost. He made his way to the railroad, not to the passenger station where they checked documents of everyone, but to the sorting station where freight trains were formed. He knew from overheard conversations of workers at the factory, when he crawled through the ventilation, that trains marked OST went to Poland without inspection. These were supply trains. Penetrating the station became another test of professionalism. Guards with dogs patrolled the perimeter. Searchlights cut through the darkness. He used the blind spot tactic. He moved synchronously with the searchlight beam, remaining in the shadow of the poles. This required inhuman concentration and a sense of rhythm. Step, pause, step, pause. He reached the tracks. Before him stood a train, long, endless. Platforms covered with tarpaulin, boxcars, tank cars. On one of the platforms, he saw a familiar silhouette. These were tank hulls, Panthers, but without turrets, just chassis. They were going for repair or refitting. He decided not to guess. He needed shelter. A boxcar with hay. Too obvious. They searched there first. An empty tank car was dangerous, gasoline fumes. He chose the most unexpected place. The brake platform of a coal car. A small booth at the end of the car, blown by all winds. It was dog cold there, but they rarely looked there. He climbed in, curling into a ball, covering himself with a piece of burlap he had found. The train started moving. The measured clatter of wheels became his lullaby and his torture. Riding on an open platform at a speed of 60 kilometers per hour is a test even for a healthy person.
The wind pierced to the bone. Sparks from the locomotive flew into his face, burning through his clothes, but he endured. He turned into stone, into part of the mechanism. He knew the journey would take at least 2 days. 2 days without food, without water, in constant cold. At stops, when the train was shunted into sidings to let military trains heading to the front pass, he heard German speech. He heard the guards tapping the wheels, heard the couplers cursing. Once, a flashlight beam slid across his booth. A guard shone the light but did not climb up to check. Who would think of riding here? On the second day, somewhere in Silesia, the unforeseen happened. At Breslau station, the train was shunted onto a reserve track, and they began to reform it. The car in which our hero was riding was uncoupled. It was to be sent to a repair depot. A dead end. If he stayed, the workers would find him. If he got out, the station guards, who were reinforced here, would notice him. Since Breslau was a fortress, he observed through a crack. A coupler approached the car, an elderly German with a hammer. He began checking the axle boxes. Our hero tensed. His hand reached for the knife. Would he really have to kill this old man? The coupler approached the brake platform. He raised his head. Their eyes met. The old man froze. He saw a man huddled in the corner, black with coal dust, with mad eyes. The German opened his mouth to shout. Our hero put a finger to his lips, a gesture of desperation. The old man hesitated for a second, then looked around. No one. He slowly lowered the hammer, took a bundle of sandwiches from his jacket pocket and threw it onto the platform, and then shouted loudly, "Axle box is fine, can be coupled." Why did he do this? Maybe he too had a son in captivity in Russia, or he was simply tired of the war. We will never know. But that sandwich with lard saved our hero's life. It gave him the calories not to freeze to death.
The car was coupled to another train. This one was definitely going east, to Poland. Crossing the border of the general government passed unnoticed. The signs at the stations simply changed.
but the atmosphere changed. Here in Poland, the air was electrified. Partisans, the home army. The forests here were more dangerous than in Germany. Trains were often derailed. Our hero understood that he could die at the hands of his own allies who would blow up the train. Approaching Dębica, a junction station before the Blizna proving ground, the train slowed down. Our hero understood. It was time to get off. Further was a special regime zone. There they check every car with dogs. Jumping from a moving train with a shot shoulder was madness, but staying was suicide. He waited until the train entered a curve and reduced speed to 20 kilometers per hour. He gathered himself into a ball, threw forward the folder with documents wrapped in burlap so as not to damage it, and jumped himself.
The impact on the embankment was brutal. He rolled head over heels over the gravel, tearing off skin, breaking nails. The pain in his shoulder exploded like a supernova. He lost consciousness for several minutes. He came to because someone was poking him in the side with a rifle barrel. He opened his eyes. People stood over him. Germans? They were dressed in mixed uniforms, German tunics, civilian caps, Soviet belts. Partisans. "Who the hell are you?" asked one of them in pure Polish. Our hero did not know Polish, but he knew one word that could save his life or kill him. He croaked, "Stalin." The Poles exchanged glances. One of them, apparently the commander, spat, "Communist or provocateur?" He cocked the trigger of a captured Schmeisser. The situation hung by a thread. The Poles from the home army did not much love Soviet soldiers, but then a third one intervened. He bent down and picked up that very folder that had fallen nearby. He unwrapped the burlap and saw German eagles and secret stamps. "Pan Commander, look. This is no ordinary bird. This is a courier. And it seems he stole something very important from the Fritzes." Our hero was not shot. He was dragged into the forest, to the camp, but not as a guest, but as a prisoner. Captivity again, interrogations again. Only now he was being interrogated by people who hated the Germans just as much as he did, but did not trust the Russians. He had to go through the hell of distrust. They did not believe that one man could have stolen a tank, blown up a factory, and traveled half of Germany on the buffer of a railway car. It sounded like the ravings of a madman, but the documents spoke for themselves. They contained diagrams of the proving ground that the partisans had been trying to scout for months, but they kept losing people in the minefields. And this Russian had brought them a map of the minefields on a silver platter. The commander of the detachment, an old colonel from that pre-war Polish army, looked at the diagram for a long time, then at our hero, who was greedily slurping soup from a mess tin. "If this is true, son," he said in Russian with a strong accent, "then you have opened the gates to hell for us. But you will have to go in there, because only you know what those damned installations look like inside." It turned out that the partisans were preparing a raid on the base, but not for destruction, but to capture samples. British intelligence had promised them mountains of gold for parts of the V-2 rocket. But our hero knew that there were not only rockets there. There was that very sonic weapon or generators for new tanks. And he understood that if this fell into the hands of the British and not Moscow, then after the war, and he believed that victory would come, the USSR would have big problems. He had to outplay everyone, the Germans, the Poles, and the British. He, a simple Soviet tank engineer, found himself at the center of a geopolitical knot. And he proposed a plan to the colonel, an insane, audacious plan. "You want to enter the camp? I will lead you, but not through the forest. We will enter through the main gate on a train that we will capture." The colonel looked at him as if he were insane. "Capture a train with pocket knives?" "No," answered our hero, wiping his lips with his sleeve.
We have something better. We have knowledge of the schedule, and we have the uniforms of the guards that you took from the dead Germans. We will stage a performance for them that they will not forget." Thus began the preparation for one of the strangest operations of the Second World War. An operation that is not officially recorded anywhere, because its participants were from different camps, temporarily united against a common evil. But before this, our hero needed to restore his strength.
The forest healed. The air of freedom healed. But most of all, he was healed by the thought that he was already close. He felt the vibration of the earth. There, beyond the forest, 20 kilometers away, the Germans were launching their rockets. The earth trembled, and each of these jolts reminded him, time is running out.